The desert wind howled through Willow Creek like a wounded animal, carrying dust and the stench of horse manure across the ramshackle buildings that dared call themselves a town. It was late autumn of 1889, and the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. Its red earth cracked like the faces of the men who scraped a living from it. At the edge of town, where even the mongrel dogs wouldn't venture, stood an old horse shed that had seen better days. Its warped boards gaped like missing teeth, and the tin roof rattled a lonesome tune with each gust. Inside, shackled to a rusted post with chains meant for livestock, sat a woman the townsfolk called the Apache witch. Her name was Sarah, though none bothered to learn it. To them, she was just another savage, captured by bounty hunters 3 weeks prior in the Dragoon Mountains. Her wrists bore the angry marks of iron, and her once proud shoulders curved inward like a bird with broken wings. The leather dress she wore hung in tatters, stiff with dried blood and desert dust. The good citizens of Willow Creek gave the shed a wide berth, crossing themselves when they passed. Women clutched their children closer, whispering tales of Apache curses and heathen magic. Men spat tobacco juice and muttered about the Indian Wars, about Geronimo and the raids that had painted the desert red. "Shoulda shot her when they brought her in," Jake Morrison declared from his perch outside the general store, his voice thick with whiskey and hate. "Ain't natural, keeping a thing like that alive." But Sheriff Wallace, fat and lazy as a fed tick, couldn't be bothered with formal charges or trials. The bounty had been collected. The Apache woman contained. Let her rot in the shed until someone decided what to do with her. It wasn't his problem if she went hungry or thirsty. Weren't his kind anyway. Into this cauldron of indifference rode Silas Boone on a Thursday afternoon, his wagon creaking under sacks of flour and coffee. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained his faded work shirt and hands scarred from years of honest labor. His face, weathered by 40-odd winters, rarely showed expression beyond a studied neutrality. Folks knew him as the hermit rancher who kept a spread up on Stone Ridge, coming to town only when supplies ran low. Silas tied his team outside Murphy's Mercantile and walked with the measured gait of a man who'd seen too much to hurry for anyone. The townspeople nodded but didn't engage. Boone was peculiar, they said, kept to himself. Some whispered he'd gone strange after the war. Others that he'd lost family to Indians and gone soft in the head. Best to leave him be. As he loaded his wagon with goods, a commotion near the saloon caught his attention. 3 cowboys, drunk despite the early hour, were throwing stones at the old shed, hooting and hollering like schoolboys. "Hey, witch woman, dance for us!" one shouted, hurling a rock that clanged against the tin roof. "Maybe she's hungry," another laughed, tossing horse droppings through the gaps in the boards. Silas's jaw tightened, but he continued loading his supplies. Not his business. Nothing in this godforsaken town was his business anymore. But as he climbed onto his wagon seat, something made him glance toward the shed. Through a gap in the boards, he saw her, just a glimpse, dark eyes and a gaunt face, watching the world that had caged her with neither hope nor plea. She didn't cower from the thrown stones or cry out at the taunts. She simply watched, as still as the desert stones, as if her spirit had already flown and left only flesh behind. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 heartbeats. Hers were black as midnight, holding depths of sorrow that seemed to echo in the hollow of his chest. Then she looked away, dismissing him as just another white man come to gawk at the captive animal. Silas drove out of town with those eyes burned into his memory. That night, in his simple cabin on Stone Ridge, he couldn't shake the image, as he fried salt pork and beans over his wood stove. Those dark eyes watched him from the shadows. When he tried to sleep on his narrow cot, they haunted the darkness behind his lids. He'd seen plenty of Indians in his time, fought them during his army days, traded with them after. But something about that woman in the shed gnawed at him like a broken tooth. Maybe it was the dignity in her stillness, or the way she hadn't begged or pleaded like he'd seen other prisoners do. Or maybe it was just that he recognized something in those eyes, the look of someone who'd had everything torn away and lived on anyway. 3 days later, Silas returned to town. This time, he brought an old wool blanket rolled tight in his saddlebag, along with hardtack and jerky wrapped in oilcloth. He conducted his business quickly, then waited for dusk to creep across the desert. When shadows grew long and the good people of Willow Creek retreated to their suppers, he approached the shed. The woman sat in the same position, chains pooling around her like iron snakes. She didn't look up when his boots crunched on the gravel, didn't acknowledge him at all. Silas left the bundle just inside the door, within reach of her chains, and walked away without a word. This became his routine. Every few days, he'd ride to town with some excuse for forgotten supplies, a tool that needed fixing. Always he'd wait for evening, then leave food and water near the shed. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of her wrapped in the blanket he'd brought, or find the food gone. But she never looked at him again, never acknowledged his presence. The townsfolk began to notice. "That Boone's been hanging around the witch's shed." "Mrs." Henderson whispered to her church friends. "Saw him there myself Tuesday evening." Always knew there was something off about him. Her companion replied, "Living alone all these years, refusing to take a proper wife, now consorting with savages." The whispers grew louder. Men started watching Silas when he came to town, hands resting on pistol butts. Sheriff Wallace, roused from his perpetual stupor by the Ladies' Temperance Committee, took notice. "Whatever you're playing at, Boone, I'd think twice," the sheriff warned one afternoon, belly straining against his vest as he leaned against Silas's wagon. "That Apache's nothing but trouble. Folks are starting to talk about stringing her up, and I might not be inclined to stop them." Silas said nothing, just continued loading his supplies with methodical precision. But that night, he didn't sleep. The first snows of winter were coming. He could smell them on the wind. The shed would offer no protection against the cold that would sweep down from the mountains. He thought of another winter, years ago, of a small house on the plains and the woman who'd made it home, of tiny graves marked with wooden crosses that the prairie wind had long since knocked down, of promises made and broken, of debts that could never be repaid. When the snow began to fall 2 nights later, thick, wet flakes that weren't supposed to come this early, Silas made his decision. He loaded his saddlebags with what he'd need: a heavy file, oil for the chains, bandages for the wounds they'd leave. His army coat went on his hip, and his Winchester across his saddle. The town slept under its blanket of unexpected snow as he rode in past midnight. No lights showed except the saloon's dim glow, and even that held only the most dedicated drunks at this hour. Silas tied his horse in the shadows behind the shed and went to work. The chains were thick, but rust and his file made short work of them. The woman, Sarah, watched him with those fathomless eyes, saying nothing as he worked. When the shackles fell away, she rubbed her raw wrists but made no move to run. "Can you ride?" Silas asked, his voice rough from disuse. She nodded once. He helped her stand, her legs shaky from weeks of sitting. She weighed no more than a child, all sharp bones under tattered leather. Without asking, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders and led her to his horse. As they mounted, she behind him, arms tentative around his waist. A shout rang out from the saloon. "The Apache's escaping! The witch is loose!" Lights flared in windows. Men stumbled into the street, some in long johns, others still drunk. Silas spurred his horse hard, and they flew through the scattering crowd like a night wind. Someone fired a shot that went wide, the sound cracking through the snowy air. Then they were past the town's edge and racing into the desert night, snow swirling around them like spirits set free. Behind them, Willow Creek erupted in fury. But Silas knew they'd never catch him in this weather. He knew every trail, every hidden canyon between here and his ranch. The woman's arms tightened around him as they rode, her body shaking with cold or fever or both. But she made no sound, not even when the trail grew treacherous and the horse stumbled on icy stones. As dawn broke gray and bitter over the mountains, they finally crested the ridge above his ranch. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving. Home had never looked so welcome or so inadequate. He'd cut her chains and brought her to safety. Now came the harder part. learning to live with the choice he'd made, and with the ghosts they both carried in the silence between them. Sarah's body gave out the moment they crossed the threshold. She collapsed against him, burning with fever, her breath coming in short, rattled gasps. Silas carried her to the narrow bed in the corner, his bed, and laid her down as gently as he could manage with his big, clumsy hands. The cabin was simple but sturdy, one room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture he'd built himself, and shelves lined with preserves and dried goods. A bachelor's dwelling, spare and functional. Now it seemed to shrink around the presence of this broken woman who shivered despite the blankets he piled upon her. Silas had learned field medicine during the war, had seen men die from less than what plagued her now. The weeks of exposure, starvation, and untreated wounds had taken their toll. Her wrists were infected where the shackles had rubbed them raw, and her breathing spoke of something settled deep in her chest. He worked through the night and into the next day. Willow bark tea for the fever, poultices of comfrey and calendula for the wounds, broth made from the last of his chickens, spooned carefully between cracked lips. She fought him at first, weakly batting away his hands, eyes wild with delirium. But exhaustion won, and she subsided into restless sleep. The ranch sat in a natural bowl of red rock, sheltered on three sides by towering cliffs. A spring-fed creek ran through the property, lined with cottonwoods that whispered secrets to the wind. It was a hard place, beautiful in its severity, scattered with barrel cactus and jumping cholla, punctuated by the occasional Joshua tree standing sentinel against the sky. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles east, and Silas liked it that way. On the second night, her fever broke. Silas had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, but woke to find those dark eyes watching him with startling clarity. He reached for the water cup, but she spoke first. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse, accented but clear. The sound of it surprised him. He'd half expected her not to speak English at all. "You were dying," he said simply. "The others would have let me. I'm not the others." She studied him for a long moment, then closed her eyes again. But he sensed it wasn't dismissal this time, more like acceptance, or perhaps just exhaustion. The next morning brought new challenges. She was strong enough to sit up, to take stock of her surroundings with those watchful eyes. Silas busied himself with breakfast, biscuits, and gravy, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, while she wrapped herself in blankets and silence. "I need to tend your wounds," he said finally, setting a basin of warm water and clean cloths on the table. She drew back, wariness flashing across her features. "I won't." He struggled for words, then simply held out the supplies. "You can do it yourself. I'll step outside." Something in her face shifted. She took the cloths and began unwrapping the soiled bandages as he turned toward the door. But her voice stopped him. "Stay." He kept his back turned while she worked, listening to the splash of water, the occasional sharp intake of breath. When she finished, he helped her rewrap the wounds with fresh linen, his touch careful and impersonal as any army surgeon's. "You know healing," she observed. "Some. Where did you learn?" "The war." "Which war?" A bitter smile touched her lips. "You whites have so many. The one where brothers killed brothers," he said quietly. Seemed fitting at the time. Days passed in careful routine. Silas went about his ranch work, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, preparing for winter, while she regained her strength. He'd given her one of his shirts and an old pair of trousers cinched with rope, her own clothes beyond salvaging. She looked lost in the oversized garments, but somehow maintained that fierce dignity he'd glimpsed in the shed. Gradually, she began to speak more. Her name was Sarah Little Crow, she told him, though her Apache name was something his tongue couldn't properly form. She'd been educated at one of the missionary schools, hence the English before returning to her people. Her band had been camping in the mountains, trying to avoid the soldiers and settlers, living on whatever game they could find. "They came at dawn," she said one evening, staring into the fire. "The hunters were away. Only women, children, and old ones in the camp." Her hands clenched in her lap. "My son was 5 winters. He ran to me when the shooting started. The bullet. She stopped, unable to continue. Silas felt his chest tighten. He'd seen such raids, had even participated in them during his army days. The official reports always called them battles, but he knew better. They were slaughters, pure and simple. "I'm sorry," he said, the words pathetically inadequate. She looked at him sharply. "You have lost children too?" It wasn't a question. Somehow she'd read it in his face, in the careful way he moved through his empty house. "Cholera," he said after a long pause. "Took my wife and both boys in the span of a week. 6 years ago come spring." Their names? No one had asked him that in all the years since. The question unlocked something in his throat. "Mary. She was sunshine itself, laughed at all my poor jokes, sang while she worked. The boys were James and little Robert, 4 and 2. He swallowed hard. "I was away, buying cattle. Came back to 3 fresh graves and a note from the preacher." They sat in silence as the fire crackled and popped. Outside, a coyote howled, and its pack answered from the distant hills. The sound was mournful but somehow fitting, a lament for all the losses that could never be recovered. As she grew stronger, Sarah began to help with small tasks around the ranch. She had clever hands and a practical nature, seeing what needed doing without being told. She patched his worn clothes with tiny, perfect stitches. She organized his chaotic pantry and somehow made his simple ingredients into meals that actually tasted like food instead of survival. But it was her knowledge of plants that truly amazed him. She'd walk the property, gathering things he'd dismissed as weeds, and transform them into medicines and seasonings. A cut on his hand that had been slow to heal cleared up within days after she applied some mysterious poultice. "Your people know the land," she said when he commented on it. "But they don't see it. They try to force it to be what they want instead of learning what it offers freely." 2 weeks after her arrival, Silas woke to find her standing outside, facing east as the sun painted the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. She was singing, a low, keening melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He stayed inside, recognizing a private moment of grief, but the sound followed him through his morning chores. That afternoon, while he'd worked on repairing a bridle, she surprised him with a question. "Why do you live so far from your people?" He considered his answer. "They're not my people anymore. Haven't been for a long time." "Because of your family?" "Partly, but even before." He set down the leather. "I came back from the war at a different. Couldn't stomach the towns anymore, the noise and pretense. People talking about progress and civilization while I remembered fields full of dead boys who'd believed the same lies." She nodded slowly. "You have the sickness too." "Sickness? The one that comes from too much death. My grandfather had it after the Mexican soldiers killed his brother. He said it was like carrying winter inside, even in summer." Silas had never heard it described better. That night, the temperature plummeted. He gave her the bed again and made his pallet by the fire, but even with the flames crackling, the cold seeped through the walls. He heard her teeth chattering and got up to add more wood. "This is foolish," she said from the darkness. "We will both freeze from pride." She was right, but he hesitated. "I don't want you to think. I think you are a good man trying too hard to prove it." There was wry humor in her voice. "Come, we can share warmth without sharing more." So he lay down beside her, careful to keep space between them, both fully clothed and wrapped in separate blankets. But in sleep, bodies seek heat. He woke near dawn to find her curled against his side, one small hand fisted in his shirt. He lay still, afraid to wake her, afraid of the feeling stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with simple warmth. When she finally stirred and realized their position, she didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You saved me," she said quietly, "but I think perhaps we are saving each other." Then she did move away, rising to tend the fire as if nothing had been said. But something fundamental had shifted between them, subtle as the change of seasons but just as inevitable. Outside, The desert was waking up. A roadrunner called from the rocks, and somewhere in the distance, wild horses thundered across the flatlands. The sun climbed higher, painting away the shadows, revealing a world harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Silas watched Sarah move about the cabin, comfortable now in what had been his solitary space, and thought about the chains that bound people. Some made of iron, others forged from grief and guilt and the terrible weight of surviving when others hadn't. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps in saving her, he'd taken the first step toward saving himself. But he also knew that Willow Creek wouldn't forget or forgive what he'd done. Sooner or later, someone would come looking. The peace they'd found here in this hidden valley was as fragile as frost in sunlight, and he wondered how long they'd be allowed to keep it. Winter settled over Stone Ridge like a gray wool blanket, bringing short days and long, quiet evenings by the fire. The ranch work continued. There were always fences to mend, cattle to tend, water to haul. But now Silas had a partner in these daily tasks. Sarah proved herself capable with surprising quickness, learning the rhythms of ranch life as if she'd been born to it. "Show me," she'd say when encountering something new. And Silas would demonstrate how to mend harness leather or gauge when a cow was about to calve. Her small hands would follow his movements precisely, mastering in hours what had taken him years to learn. The day she first smiled, really smiled, not just the bitter twist of lips he'd seen before, was when they were trying to pen a particularly obstinate calf. The creature had led them on a chase through the brush, darting between their legs and bawling for its mother. Finally, Sarah dove sideways and caught it around the middle, both of them tumbling into the dirt. She came up laughing, covered in dust, the calf still wriggling in her arms. "You're as stubborn as my little brother was," she told the calf in Apache, then glanced at Silas. He would hide when it was time for chores. We'd find him in the strangest places. It was the first time she'd mentioned family beyond her lost son, and Silas treasured the small opening into her past. They developed an easy routine. Mornings began before dawn, tending the stock and breaking ice on the water troughs. Sarah had taken over the cooking entirely, somehow making even beans and salt pork taste like a feast. She taught him Apache words for things around the ranch, laughing at his clumsy pronunciation but patient with his efforts. "No, no," she'd say, shaking her head. "From here." She'd touch her throat. The sound comes from deeper. In return, he showed her how to read the weather in cloud formations, how to doctor a horse's split hoof, how to tell good grazing land from bad by the color of the grass. They worked side by side patching the barn roof, her holding boards while he hammered, neither needing to fill the comfortable silence with unnecessary words. One afternoon, while sorting through his meager medical supplies, Sarah made a disapproving sound. "Half of these are worthless," she declared, holding up a bottle of patent medicine. "Snake oil and alcohol. No wonder white men stay sick." "What would you use instead?" She considered this. "Come, I'll show you." They spent the rest of the day walking the property while she pointed out various plants. Manzanita for infections, mesquite pods for flour, prickly pear for wounds. She showed him how to harvest them properly, taking only what was needed, always leaving enough for regeneration. "The land provides everything," she explained, carefully digging around a desert marigold. "But you must know how to ask, and you must give back." That evening, she created a medicine bundle from their gathering, explaining each herb's purpose as she worked. Silas watched her deft movements, the way firelight played across her face as she concentrated. Something warm and dangerous stirred in his chest. The moment came 2 weeks before Christmas. They'd been working to repair the chicken coop after coyotes had tried to break in. The afternoon was unseasonably warm, and both had shed their coats. As Sarah reached up to hand him a board, her sleeve pulled back, revealing the scars on her wrist. Without thinking, Silas touched them gently. She went very still. "I'm sorry," he started to say, pulling back, but she caught his hand. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't apologize for seeing me." They stood frozen like that, her hand over his, both breathing carefully. Then she stepped closer, rising on her toes to touch his face. Her fingers traced the scar on his jaw, a souvenir from a Confederate mini-ball. "We match," she whispered. The kiss was inevitable, as sunrise, soft, tentative, tasting of the peppermint tea she favored. Silas felt something crack open in his chest, a door he'd barred for 6 years swinging wide. When they broke apart, Sarah's eyes were bright with tears. "I thought I'd forgotten how to feel anything but anger," she said. "So did I." But they stepped apart by mutual consent, both recognizing the weight of what lay between them. It wasn't just attraction, it was the possibility of truly living again. And that terrified them both. They didn't speak of it, but something had changed. Their casual touches lingered, their eyes met and held across the dinner table. At night, lying in their separate spaces, both were achingly aware of the other's breathing in the darkness. The tension broke during a December storm. Wind howled down from the mountains, driving snow horizontal, making the cabin walls groan. They'd brought the horses into the barn and secured everything they could, but the storm's fury was beyond anything Silas had seen in his years on the ridge. Near midnight, part of the barn roof gave way. Silas rushed out into the blizzard, Sarah right behind him despite his shouts to stay inside. Together they fought to move the horses to the sheltered side, to pile hay bales against the gap. By the time they stumbled back inside, both were soaked and half frozen. Sarah's teeth chattered so hard she couldn't speak. Silas stoked the fire high and pulled blankets from the bed, but she couldn't stop shaking. Finally, desperate, he pulled her against him, wrapping them both in every blanket they owned. "Just warming up," he said roughly. "Nothing more." But when her shivering finally stopped, neither moved away. Sarah turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held storms of their own. "I'm not broken," she said fiercely. "What they did to me, what I lost, it didn't break me." "I know. I can choose. I choose this." This time when they kissed, it was with full intent, no hesitation. They loved with the desperation of people who'd thought themselves dead to such feelings. Careful and fierce by turns. Later, wrapped together while the storm raged outside. Sarah traced patterns on his chest. "My grandmother would say the spirit sent that storm," she murmured, "to bring us together, to stop us from being fools." She raised herself on one elbow to look at him. "I was going to leave." The words hit him like cold water. "When?" "I hadn't decided, but I thought it would be easier for you, the people in town. They won't forget. Your life here?" He stopped her with a kiss. "My life here was no life at all. Just existing, going through the motions. And now I have a reason to wake up in the morning." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in my language, there's a word, gozo. It means everything in balance, in harmony. I haven't felt gozo since... She swallowed. "Since before. But here, with you, I begin to feel it again." The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving a world transformed by white. They worked together to dig out, to repair what could be repaired, but both were changed by what had passed between them. The careful distance was gone, replaced by something deeper, a partnership of body and soul. As Christmas approached, Sarah worked on something in secret, shooing him away when he tried to peek. On Christmas Eve, she presented him with a shirt she'd made from trade cloth bought on their last trip to town, decorated with simple but elegant beadwork. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the geometric patterns. "But you shouldn't have risked going to town. I didn't go far, and I wanted..." She paused. "I wanted to give you something made with a love. It's been so long since I made anything with love." He pulled her close, breathing in the sage and sunshine scent of her hair. "You've given me everything already." That night, they stood together watching the stars wheel overhead in the crystal clear sky. Sarah named the constellations in Apache, telling him the stories her grandfather had shared. Silas pointed out the ones he knew, the navigation aids he'd learned in the army. Different names, same stars. Sarah observed. Perhaps that's all any of us are. Different names for the same hopes. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. The small cabin that had once felt like a prison of solitude now felt like home. They'd built something here, fragile as spring ice but twice as precious for its delicacy. Both knew that challenges lay ahead. The world beyond Stone Ridge wouldn't leave them in peace forever. But for now, in this moment, they had each other and the life they were carefully constructing from the ashes of their losses. Next spring, Sarah said suddenly, I want to plant a garden, corn, squash, beans, the three sisters. We call them... Silas smiled at the thought of green things growing where only sorrow had taken root before. I'd like that. And maybe, she hesitated, maybe we could build another room for someday. The implication hung between them, bright with possibility. Children, future, hope. Someday, he agreed, and felt his heart lift at the word. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, like a blessing. The trouble started with hoofprints in the melting snow. Silas found them while checking his fence line, 3 riders who'd circled the property, stopping at various points to observe. His blood ran cold as he read the signs. Shod horses. One with a distinctive crack in the left front shoe he'd noticed before in town. We need supplies, he told Sarah that evening, keeping his voice casual. I'll ride to Fort Buchanan tomorrow. Better prices than Willow Creek. She looked up from the harness she was mending, dark eyes seeing through his pretense. They've been here. It wasn't a question. Somehow she always knew. 3 of them, scouting. He set his rifle by the door, checked the loads. Probably that bounty hunter, Tom Garrett. He had his eye on me before. Sarah's hand stilled on the leather. I should go. No. Silas. No. He crossed to her, taking her hands. We knew this might come. We'll face it together. But fate had other plans. A week later, Silas rode out to retrieve a stray calf, promising to return by noon. The sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened, and Sarah worked in the garden plot they'd cleared, humming an old song her mother had taught her. The first warning was the horses whinnying in alarm. 3 men materialized from the rocks like evil spirits. Garrett, tall and lean with dead eyes, flanked by 2 Mexican hired guns. Sarah straightened slowly, the hoe still in her hands. Well, Garrett drawled, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. The Apache witch, living pretty as you please. Folks in town are mighty upset about you flying the coop. Sarah said nothing, calculating distances. Options. The cabin door stood 20 feet away. Too far. Nothing to say? You spoke English plenty good when you were begging Boone for food. Garrett dismounted, spurs jangling. Course, maybe you paid him other ways. That why he cut you loose? Still she remained silent, grip tightening on the hoe handle. Ramon, Garrett gestured to one of his men. Check the cabin. See what goods our friend Boone might object to losing. As Ramon moved toward the door, Sarah acted. The hoe swung in a vicious arc, catching him across the jaw. He dropped like a felled tree, but before she could reverse the swing, Garrett's fist connected with her temple. The world exploded in stars. When her vision cleared, she was face down in the dirt, hands being tied behind her back. Blood trickled from her nose. Feisty one. Garrett grunted. See why the army wants you back. Example needs to be made. He hauled her upright, fingers digging cruelly into her arms. Where's Boone? She spat blood at his feet. The blow knocked her down again. This time, Garrett's boot connected with her ribs. I asked you a question. Savage. Gone, she gasped. Left 2 days ago. Liar. But uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He'd seen only one horse in the corral. Carlos. Toss the place. Take anything worth hauling. They ransacked the cabin with professional thoroughness, stealing what they could carry, destroying what they couldn't. Sarah watched through swelling eyes as they shattered her medicine bottles, scattered the herbs she'd so carefully dried, ripped apart the quilt she'd been making. Mount up, Garrett finally ordered. He threw Sarah across his saddle like a sack of grain, ignoring her grunt of pain. Boone comes looking. He'll find our trail easy enough. Either way, we get paid. The ride was agony. Each jolt sent fire through her ribs, and the saddle horn dug into her stomach. But Sarah endured in silence, saving her strength, watching the ground pass below for landmarks. They were heading southeast, toward the old military road. 2 hours out, Garrett called a halt at Skeleton Creek to water the horses. They dumped Sarah on the ground, Carlos standing guard while the others tended their mounts. She tested her bonds, rawhide, tied wet so they'd tighten as they dried. Already her hands were going numb. "You know what they'll do to you," Carlos said conversationally in Spanish, thinking she wouldn't understand. The soldiers have special ways with Apache women, especially the pretty ones. Sarah closed her eyes, retreating into herself the way her grandmother had taught her. Find the quiet center, the place pain couldn't reach. She'd survived before. She would survive again. The sun was westering when they heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Garrett smiled, checking his pistol. "Right on time. Carlos, watch the woman. Ramon, get behind those rocks. Let's give Mr. Boone a proper welcome." But Silas had learned caution in the war. He dismounted well back, using a boulder for cover. "Let her go. Garrett, your quarrel's with me." "No quarrel at all," Garrett called back cheerfully. "Just business. The Apache's worth $200 delivered to Fort Buchanan. You're worth another $100 if I bring you in for aiding a fugitive." "I've got $300 in gold hidden at the ranch. It's yours. Just right away." Garrett laughed. "Now, why would I settle for 3 when I can have 5? Besides, I already tossed your place. Couldn't find no gold." Sarah watched Silas from where she lay. He'd positioned himself well, but it was still 3 against 1. She caught Carlos's attention, moaning as if in pain. When he bent to check her bonds, she rolled suddenly, sweeping his legs. He went down hard, gun flying from his hand. The distraction was all Silas needed. His rifle cracked, and Ramon tumbled from the rocks. Garrett dove for cover, firing wildly. Carlos scrambled for his weapon, but Sarah kicked it into the brush, then rolled behind a fallen log as bullets whined overhead. The firefight was brief but vicious. Garrett was good, but Silas had learned patience from Apache fighters themselves. He waited, watched, then placed his shot exactly where Garrett would appear. The bounty hunter fell with a bullet through his chest, dead before he hit the ground. Carlos, seeing both partners down, threw away his gun and raised his hands. "I quit! Don't shoot!" Silas approached carefully, rifle trained on the surviving gunman. "Cut her loose," he ordered. Carlos fumbled with the knots, finally freeing Sarah's hands. She rubbed feeling back into them, then, without warning, grabbed Carlos's own knife and pressed it to his throat. "Sarah, no," Silas said quietly. She met his eyes over Carlos's terrified face. For a moment, violence warred with mercy in her expression. Then she shoved him away. "Run," she said in perfect Spanish. "Run and don't come back." Carlos didn't need a second invitation. He sprinted for his horse and was gone in a cloud of dust. Silas caught Sarah as she swayed, finally allowing himself to see her injuries. The swollen eye, bloodied nose, way she held her ribs. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough. "I should have been there." "You were," she replied, leaning into him. "You came." They buried Garrett and Ramon in shallow graves, marking them with stones out of respect for the dead, if not the men. Then Silas lifted Sarah onto his horse, swinging up behind her for the ride home. The cabin was a disaster, but fixable. As Silas tended Sarah's injuries, she told him about the fight, even managing a weak smile when describing Carlos's expression when she'd taken his knife. "We can't stay," she said finally. "More will come." "I know." Silas finished wrapping her ribs, hands gentle. "Been thinking about Colorado. Man I knew from the war has a spread up there. Says folks mind their own business better." Sarah touched his face, tracing the new lines of worry there. "Always running. Is that the life you want? Life with you?" He caught her hand, pressed it to his lips. I'd run to the ends of the earth. That night, as she lay in his arms, Sarah made a decision. She'd been the cause of enough upheaval in his life. When he was asleep, she rose carefully, dressed in the darkness, and slipped outside. But Silas knew her too well. He was waiting by the corral, her traveling bundle already in his hands. "Going somewhere?" She stopped, shoulders slumping. "You foolish man. Why couldn't you let me go?" "Because," he said simply, "I've already lost everything once. I won't survive it again, and neither will you." He was right, and she knew it. They'd become necessary to each other. Two halves of something broken made whole. Sarah walked to him slowly, taking the bundle from his hands. "Then we go together. North, south, doesn't matter, but together." "Together," he agreed, pulling her close. As dawn broke over Stone Ridge, they prepared to leave the only home Silas had known for 6 years. But home, he was learning, wasn't a place. It was the person standing beside you when the world tried to tear you apart. It was choosing love over safety, hope over fear. They loaded the wagon with what could be salvaged, saddled the horses, and turned their faces toward an uncertain future behind them. The cabin stood empty but for the memories held in its walls. Sorrow transformed to joy, loneliness to companionship. Two separate griefs merged into one shared strength. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, full of dangers and possibilities in equal measure. But they would face it as they'd learned to face everything else, together, step by step, hand in hand. The journey north stretched before them like an unwritten promise. They traveled at night when possible, avoiding main roads, following deer trails and dry washes that Silas remembered from his ranging days. Sarah's ribs pained her, but she made no complaint, riding straight-backed beside him as the miles fell away beneath their horses' hooves. On the fourth night, camped in a grove of cottonwoods beside a muddy stream, they finally allowed themselves to breathe. The fire was small, carefully banked to show little smoke, but its warmth was welcome against the high desert cold. "Does it hurt?" Silas asked, watching her move stiffly as she prepared their simple meal. "Everything hurts," Sarah replied with characteristic honesty. "But I'm alive. We're alive." She handed him a plate of beans and hard biscuit. "That's what matters." They ate in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds, an owl calling from the darkness, the distant yip of coyotes. These were safe sounds, natural ones. It was the unnatural silence they'd learned to fear, the pause before human violence struck. "Tell me about Colorado," Sarah said eventually. Silas leaned back against his saddle, remembering. "Green," he said, "greener than anything you've seen. Mountains that scrape the sky, covered in pine and aspen. Snow stays on the peaks, even in summer. And the valleys," he smiled. "Grass so thick the cattle get fat just looking at it. Your friend lives there?" "Jacob Morrison. Saved his life at Chancellorsville, and he never let me forget it. Last letter I had, 2 years back. He was running cattle outside a place called Cedar Ridge. Said they needed good men, that folks there had better things to do than worry about who was married to whom." Sarah studied his face in the firelight. "You haven't written him in 2 years. He might not even be there. Then we'll find somewhere else." Silas reached across the small space between them, taking her hand. "North, south, east, west, doesn't matter as long as we're together." She squeezed his fingers but said nothing, her eyes distant. He knew that look now, knew she was thinking of her son, of the life she'd had before violence tore it away, just as he sometimes thought of Mary and the boys, wondering what they'd make of this strange turn his life had taken. 2 nights later, the past caught up with them in an unexpected way. They'd made camp early due to Sarah's exhaustion, finding shelter in a box canyon with good grass for the horses. Silas was gathering firewood when he heard her cry out, not in pain, but in recognition. He ran back to find her standing frozen, staring at 3 Apache warriors who'd materialized from the rocks like ghosts. His hand went to his rifle, but Sarah touched his arm. "No," she said quietly. "I know them." The lead warrior was perhaps 40, his face weathered to leather, eyes hard as obsidian, He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing at Sarah, at Silas, at their camp. Sarah responded in the same language, her voice steady but emotional. "What's happening?" Silas asked, not loosening his grip on the rifle. "This is Samuel Crow Dog," Sarah said, still in that careful tone. "My husband's brother." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Husband. She'd never mentioned a husband. Samuel spoke again, longer this time, his words carrying what sounded like both sorrow and anger. Sarah's replies grew heated, and suddenly she was gesturing at Silas, at herself, her voice rising. The other two warriors watched impassively, hands near their weapons. Finally, Samuel said something that made Sarah go very still. She replied in a whisper, then stronger, lifting her chin with the pride Silas had come to know so well. The Apache leader studied her for a long moment, then turned that penetrating gaze on Silas. "He wants to know if you're a good man," Sarah translated. "If you took me by force, or if I came willingly." Silas met the warrior's eyes steadily. "Tell him you came of your own choice. Tell him I would die before I'd let anyone harm you." Sarah translated, and something in Samuel's expression shifted. He spoke again, quieter now. "He says," Sarah's voice caught, "he says my husband died fighting the soldiers 6 months ago, that the band scattered, that they've been running ever since. He's been looking for me, heard rumors of an Apache woman in Willow Creek. What does he want? He wants me to come back." She was trembling now. "To take my place with the people, to help the children remember the old ways before they're lost forever." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Of course she would have people looking for her, a life beyond what they'd built together. He forced himself to speak past the constriction in his throat. "What did you tell him?" Sarah turned to face him fully, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "I told him my place is with you now, that my heart chose a new path." Samuel spoke once more, short and sharp. Then he reached into his pouch and withdrew something, tossing it to Sarah. She caught it reflexively, a small leather bag decorated with beadwork. "Medicine bundle," she whispered. "From my mother's mother. I thought it was lost when—" She pressed it to her chest, shoulders shaking. The 3 warriors turned to go, but Samuel paused, looking back at Silas. He spoke in accented but clear English. "You keep her safe. White man. She is the last of her line. The children she bears will need to know both worlds to survive what's coming." Then they were gone, vanishing into the rocks as suddenly as they'd appeared. Sarah collapsed to her knees, clutching the medicine bundle, sobbing with a grief she'd held back for months. Silas knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms, letting her cry against his chest. He understood now. She'd lost even more than he'd known. Not just her son, but her husband, her entire world. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I should have told you." "Shh." He stroked her hair. "Nothing to be sorry for." "I loved him," she said, needing him to understand. "He was a good man, a good father. But he's gone, and I was so angry, so lost. Then you—" She pulled back to look at him. "You brought me back to life. Is it wrong to want to live?" "No," Silas said firmly. "It's not wrong. It's the bravest thing there is." They held each other as darkness fell. 2 people who'd lost everything finding strength in their shared survival. Later, by the fire. Sarah opened the medicine bundle, showing him the sacred items inside: an eagle feather, a small carved figure, herbs wrapped in red cloth. "This was meant for my daughter," she said softly. "If I'd had one. Now." She looked at him, hope and fear warring in her eyes. Silas understood what she was asking, what she was offering. A future. Children who would carry both their bloodlines, both their worlds. "Cedar Ridge," he said. "We'll build something new there, something that's ours." She smiled through her tears. "Yes." They made love that night with a different quality than before. Not the desperate passion of 2 people afraid of loss, but the deeper intimacy of souls choosing each other fully. with complete knowledge of what they were leaving behind and what they were walking toward. In the morning, they woke to find 3 horses tethered near their camp gifts from Samuel. Sarah explained, Apache horses, tough and desert-wise, a blessing for their journey, an acknowledgement of her choice. He didn't have to do that, Silas said, admiring the animals. Family is family, Sarah replied, even when paths diverge. They broke camp with renewed purpose, the extra horses allowing them to travel faster, farther. The landscape began to change as they climbed north, red rocks giving way to juniper forests, the air growing cooler and tinged with pine. On the 10th day, they crested a ridge and saw it spread below them, a valley so green it hurt the eyes after weeks of desert brown. A river wound through it like a silver snake, and in the distance, mountains rose blue and majestic. Colorado, Silas breathed. Sarah reached over to take his hand. Home. He looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd survived so much, who'd chosen him against all reason and convention. Her face had healed, leaving only faint shadows of bruises, but her eyes held new depths, new understanding. Wherever you are, he said, that's home. They started down into the valley together, toward whatever future awaited them in this new land. Behind them, the past fell away like shed skin. Ahead lay possibility, challenge, the chance to build something from the ashes of their former lives. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces, lighting their way forward. And somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its welcome, the notes carrying on the clean mountain air like a promise of peace. Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at, a scattering of buildings along a muddy main street, smoke rising from chimneys into the crisp mountain air. But after weeks on the trail, it looked like civilization itself. Silas pulled up outside the general store, helping Sarah down from her horse. She moved carefully, one hand pressed to her ribs, though the worst of the pain had passed. Wait here, he said, but she shook her head. We go together, always. So they entered the store side by side, aware of the sudden silence that greeted them. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked from Silas to Sarah and back again. Help you folks? Looking for Jacob Morrison. Silas said, he wrote me about work hereabouts. The man's expression shifted slightly. Jake Morrison has a spread about 5 miles north. You the fellow saved his hide in the war? That's me, Silas Boone. Huh. The proprietor's gaze lingered on Sarah. Jake didn't mention you'd be bringing company. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting his stare directly. I am his wife, she said clearly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. They'd discussed this on the trail, the lie that would become truth as soon as they could find someone to make it official. It was safer than the alternative, offering some protection under white man's law. That's so? The proprietor's tone was carefully neutral. Well, Jake's usually in town Saturdays. That's 3 days hence. You folks need supplies? They purchased what they needed, aware of whispered conversations starting up behind them. News would travel fast in a town this size. By the time they left, loaded with provisions, half of Cedar Ridge would know about the stranger and his Apache woman. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a German widow named Mrs. Muller, who took one look at Sarah's careful movements and clucked disapprovingly. You are hurt, she said in accented English. Come, I have salve. To their surprise, she led them to a clean room with 2 beds, treating them with brisk kindness. As she helped Sarah with her ribs, she spoke quietly. I came to this country with nothing. People looked at me like I was dirt because I spoke different, looked different. Is not right. She patted Sarah's shoulder. You rest. Bathhouse is out back, supper at 6. That evening in the dining room, they faced the other boarders' stares with quiet dignity. Most looked away quickly, but one woman, young, pretty, with corn silk hair, smiled tentatively at Sarah. I'm Emma Patterson, she said. My husband runs the mill. Welcome to Cedar Ridge. It was a small kindness, but it warmed them both. After supper, they walked through the town, Sarah's hand on Silas's arm, taking the measure of what might become their home. The mountains rose all around, still capped with snow, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. Saturday brought Jacob Morrison, riding in with the easy confidence of a successful rancher. He was smaller than Silas remembered, weathered by years of mountain sun, but his grin was the same. "Silas Boone, you old dog!" He pumped Silas's hand enthusiastically. "Thought you'd fallen off the edge of the world." "Nearly did." Silas drew Sarah forward. "Jake, this is Sarah, my wife." Jacob's smile never faltered, though his eyes sharpened with interest. "Ma'am, right pleased to meet you." He looked between them. "Wife, huh? Well, that's fine, just fine. You folks looking to settle?" "If there's work." "Work?" Jake laughed. "Hell, I got more work than I know what to do with. Just bought another 1,000 acres up Eagle Creek Way. Been looking for someone to manage it, build a house, run some cattle. Interested?" Silas felt Sarah's hand tighten on his arm. "Very interested." They spent the next hour in the saloon, Sarah politely declining to enter, waiting outside, discussing terms. The deal was more than fair. Silas would manage the Eagle Creek property, taking a percentage of the profits. Jake would provide the initial stock and supplies for building. "There's a cabin up there already," Jake explained. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep the weather out while you build something better. Spring water, good grass, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds." "What's the catch?" Silas asked, knowing there had to be one. Jake's expression sobered. "Folks around here are mostly live and let live, but some won't take kindly to—" He paused. "Mixed marriages. You'll have neighbors eventually. How they treat you will depend on how you handle yourselves." "We can handle ourselves." "I expect you can." Jake raised his glass. "Here's to new beginnings." They rode out to Eagle Creek the next morning, following a trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The cabin, when it came into view, made Sarah gasp. It sat in a meadow backed by towering peaks, a creek dancing over stones nearby. The structure itself was rough but solid. One room with a loft, a stone fireplace, real glass windows. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. Jake grinned. "Wait till you see it in full summer. Wildflowers thick as a carpet. Course, winters are hard. Snow gets deep. But you strike me as folks who can handle hard." After Jake left, promising to send up supplies and some starter cattle, they stood together in what would be their home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden squares on the wooden floor. "Are you sure?" Silas asked. "It's isolated. The nearest neighbor is 2 miles off." Sarah walked to him, placing her hands on his chest. "After what we've survived, this is paradise." They worked through the spring and into summer, transforming the rough cabin into a home. Sarah planted her garden corn. Beans and squash intertwined as her people had always done. She gathered wild herbs, rebuilding her medicine stores. Her knowledge proved valuable when a neighbor's child took sick with fever. Word spread that the Apache woman had healing hands. Silas built furniture, expanded the cabin, constructed a barn. The cattle Jake sent thrived on the mountain grass. Slowly, carefully, they made a place for themselves. The first test came in late July. 3 families had settled further up the valley, and they organized a barn raising for one of them. Jake rode up specifically to invite Silas and Sarah. "It's important," he said. "Show you're part of the community." Sarah was quiet as she dressed that morning, choosing her best dress, one they'd bought in town. Simple but respectable. She braided her hair in a coronet, hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. "You don't have to come," Silas said. "I can make excuses." "No." She turned to face him. "We hide from nothing." The barn raising was in full swing when they arrived. Work stopped momentarily as people registered their presence, then resumed with determined normalcy. Sarah joined the women preparing food. Silas, the men raising beams. By noon, the barn skeleton stood against the sky. During the meal, Sarah found herself beside Emma Patterson again. The miller's wife had brought her 2 young children, who stared at Sarah with frank curiosity. "Is it true you're Indian?" the boy asked, earning a sharp word from his mother. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Apache. Did you live in a teepee?" Despite herself, Sarah smiled. No, we lived in wickiups, made from branches and grass. The boy's eyes widened. Could you show me how? By afternoon, Sarah had a small crowd of children watching as she demonstrated how to weave grass into simple baskets. Their parents watched too. Suspicion gradually replaced by something closer to acceptance. She's good with young ones, an older woman commented to Silas. You planning on having any of your own? Silas glanced at Sarah, surrounded by laughing children, and felt his heart swell. God willing. As they rode home in the sunset light, Sarah was quiet. Finally, she spoke. That woman who asked about children, she didn't mean to be cruel. I know, but it made me think. She paused. What if I can't? After everything, what if... Silas reached over, taking her hand. Then we'll love each other. That's enough. She squeezed his fingers. Is it? For me it is. But life had other plans. 6 weeks later, on a morning when frost first touched the meadow grass, Sarah emerged from the outhouse pale and shaking. Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. What's wrong? Are you ill? She looked up at him with eyes full of wonder and terror. I'm with child. The words hung between them like suspended stars. Then Silas was kneeling before her, gathering her hands in his. You're sure? My grandmother's medicine bundle. There are signs, and I haven't bled for 2 months. I thought it was the strain, the travel, but... She searched his face. Are you angry? Angry. He pulled her against him, feeling her heart race against his chest. Sarah, it's a miracle. They held each other as the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains gold, new life growing where there had been only death, hope where there had been only survival. It seemed too precious to be real, too fragile for this hard world. We'll need to add that room now, Silas said finally, making her laugh through her tears. And think of names, and find a midwife, and... Sarah paused, then spoke firmly. And make our marriage real in their eyes. For the child. Silas nodded. It was time. They'd been living as husband and wife for months, but the child would need the protection of legitimacy. That Sunday, they rode to town and stood before the circuit preacher, Jacob Morrison and Emma Patterson as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, the preacher only stumbling slightly over the words as he looked between them. But when he pronounced them man and wife, Sarah's smile was radiant as sunrise. Not exactly how I pictured my wedding day, she told Silas that night as they lay entwined in their bed. How did you picture it? Apache ceremony, dancing until dawn, my mother singing the old songs. Her voice caught. My son throwing flower petals. Silas held her tighter. I'm sorry. No. She turned in his arms to face him. This is my life now, our life, and I choose it. Every day, I choose it. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside, warmed by fire and love and the promise of new beginnings, they were already building spring. Winter wrapped Eagle Creek in a blanket of white silence. Sarah's belly grew round with new life as the snow deepened around their cabin, and Silas found himself watching her with a mixture of wonder and worry. She moved differently now, one hand often resting protectively on the swell where their child grew, but her spirit remained strong. The community's acceptance came in small, unexpected ways. Emma Patterson rode up through the snow one January day with a bundle of baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Mrs. Muller sent up preserves and knitted blankets. Even some who'd been coldest at first began to nod in greeting when they met the Boones in town. But it was Martha Littlefield who became Sarah's unlikely champion. The doctor's wife, pillar of Cedar Ridge society, had initially been among the most disapproving. That changed the night her husband was called to a mining accident 20 miles away, leaving her to handle a medical crisis alone. Young Tommy Henderson had fallen through ice while skating, pulled out blue and barely breathing. His frantic mother brought him to the Littlefield house, where Martha found herself helpless with panic. Someone she never learned who rode for Sarah. She arrived with her medicine bundle and a calm that cut through the chaos, while Martha boiled water and tore bandages. Sarah worked over the boy with herbs and techniques passed down through generations. She showed Martha how to rub warmth back into his limbs, how to clear his lungs, how to coax life back into the small body. When Tommy finally coughed up creek water and began to breathe normally, Martha Littlefield looked at Sarah with new eyes. "I misjudged you," she said simply. "Forgive me." From that night forward, Martha became Sarah's fierce defender. When the church ladies whispered, she silenced them with a look. When the topic of midwives arose, she declared that Sarah would attend her own next birth. Coming from the doctor's wife, it carried weight. Spring arrived in a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers. Sarah, now heavily pregnant, worked in her expanded garden while Silas built an addition to the cabin, 2 rooms that would give them space for the baby and, God willing, more children to come. It was while setting foundation stones that he noticed riders approaching, 3 men, moving with the purposeful pace of those on business. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall. But as they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Daniels from Cedar Ridge, a fair man who'd always treated them with respect. The other 2 were strangers. "Afternoon. Silas," Daniels called, dismounting. "These gentlemen are from Fort Lyon. Got some questions about your wife." The taller stranger, wearing captain's bars, stepped forward. "Captain Morrison, we're investigating reports of Apache raiders hitting supply wagons east of here. Been tracking them for weeks." Silas kept his expression neutral. "What's that got to do with Sarah?" "Your wife is Apache, isn't she? From the White Mountain Band." "She's my wife," Silas said firmly. "A citizen of Cedar Ridge, been here all winter, as anyone in town can tell you." The captain's eyes narrowed. "We have reports of a woman matching her description among the raiders." Before Silas could respond, Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, even heavy with child. She moved with dignity, head high as she approached the men. "I am Sarah Boone," she said clearly. "I have not left this valley since we arrived last autumn. Ask anyone in town. I attended the Hendersons when their boy nearly drowned. I helped birth Mary Patterson's baby last month. I am no raider." Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. "That's true. Captain, Mrs. Boone's been a help to folks here. Couldn't have been her you were tracking." The captain studied Sarah with cold eyes. "You speak very good English for an Apache." "I was educated at the mission school," Sarah replied, "before soldiers burned it down." The tension stretched taut until the sheriff intervened. "Seems clear enough. Captain, you're chasing shadows here." After a long moment, the captain nodded curtly. "Perhaps, but we'll be watching." He mounted his horse, adding, "Indians don't change their nature just because they put on white clothes." They rode away, leaving a bitter taste behind. That night, Silas held Sarah as she trembled, not with fear, but with rage. "It will never end," she said. "Every time something happens, they'll come looking. Then we'll face them," Silas said. "Every time. Together." The baby came with the summer heat, on a night when thunder rolled across the mountains. Martha Littlefield and Emma Patterson attended, but it was Sarah who knew what to do when the labor stretched too long, when the baby seemed stuck. Apache women birth standing. She gasped between contractions. "Help me up," against Martha's protests. They supported her as she squatted, working with gravity and instinct. The baby came in a rush of blood and water. A girl, perfect and squalling, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. "Elizabeth," Sarah whispered, cradling the infant. "Elizabeth Hope Boone." Silas, who'd waited outside according to custom, was allowed in to meet his daughter. He took the tiny bundle with shaking hands, marveling at the miracle of her, this child who carried both their worlds in her blood. "She's beautiful," he said, voice rough with emotion. "She's ours," Sarah replied, and in those 2 words was everything. Love, defiance, promise. News of the birth spread quickly. Gifts appeared on their doorstep, A carved wooden rattle, tiny moccasins, a quilt stitched with mountain flowers. Even some who'd kept their distance came to peek at the baby who represented something new in their divided world. But not everyone celebrated. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, Silas found a note nailed to his barn door. "Half-breeds ain't welcome here. Take your squaw and mongrel and get." He burned the note without showing Sarah. But she knew. She always knew. "We could leave," she said one evening as she nursed Elizabeth. "Find somewhere else." "No." Silas's voice was firm. "This is our home. We've earned our place here." As if to test their resolve, drought struck in late summer. Creeks ran low. Grass yellowed. Cattle grew thin. The community pulled together, sharing water rights, moving herds to better grazing. When the Hendersons' well ran dry, it was Silas who helped dig a new one. When the Pattersons' baby took sick in the heat, it was Sarah who nursed him through the fever. Slowly, deed by deed, they wove themselves into the fabric of Cedar Ridge. Not everyone accepted them, might never accept them. But enough did. Enough to make a life. Autumn brought relief in the form of rain, and with it, an unexpected visitor. Samuel Crow Dog appeared one evening like a ghost from Sarah's past. But this time he came alone and in peace. "I hear you have a daughter," he said in Apache, studying Elizabeth sleeping in her cradle. "Yes," Sarah replied in the same language. "She is healthy and strong." Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then, "The children need teachers. Too many forget the old ways, trying to become white. Will you?" "No." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "This is my path now, but—" She went to her trunk, withdrew items carefully preserved. "These are the stories, the songs, written down. When Elizabeth is older, I will teach her. And if others want to learn—" Samuel took the papers with reverent hands. "You walk between worlds, as will she," Sarah said, looking at her daughter. "As must we all, now." Before he left, Samuel placed a hand on Elizabeth's head in blessing. "May she know both strength and wisdom," he said in English, including Silas in the moment. "May she bridge what others would divide." Winter came early that year, but they were ready. The expanded cabin was snug, the barn full of hay, the root cellar stocked. Elizabeth grew round and happy, babbling in a mixture of sounds that might become either language. On Christmas Eve, they hosted their first gathering. Jake Morrison and his family, the Pattersons, Martha Littlefield, Mrs. Muller, all crowded into their home for a meal that mixed traditions. Sarah served venison stew alongside German Stollen, Apache fry bread next to apple pie. "To the Boones." Jake raised his glass. "Who've shown us that different doesn't mean wrong." Not everyone raised their glasses, but enough did, enough to matter, later. As snow fell softly outside and their guests departed with warm farewells, Silas and Sarah sat by the fire with Elizabeth sleeping between them. "Do you miss it?" Silas asked quietly. "Your old life?" Sarah considered. "I miss my people. I mourn what was lost, but—" She looked at him, at their daughter, at the home they'd built. "I cannot live in yesterday. This is my today, our tomorrow." He took her hand, rough fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. "No regrets? How can I regret the path that brought me you, that gave us her?" She smiled. "The grandmothers say every soul chooses its time to be born. Elizabeth chose to come now, to us, in this place. Who are we to argue with such wisdom?" Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Elizabeth stirred in her sleep, making small sounds of contentment. They were family, forged in loss, tempered by trials, but solid now as the mountains that surrounded them. The future remained uncertain. There would be more challenges, more prejudice to face, more bridges to build between worlds that too often stood apart. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other and the life they'd built from the ashes of their pasts. It was enough. More than enough. It was home. 5 years had painted their story across Eagle Creek Valley in seasons of joy and sorrow, triumph and trial. Elizabeth had grown into a spirited child with her mother's grace and her father's steady strength, speaking both English and Apache with the fluid ease of youth. Her laughter rang across the meadows where she played, building bridges between worlds with every friend she made. On this particular spring morning, Sarah stood on the rise behind their expanded home, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other resting on her swollen belly. Their second child quickened within her, a dancer like Elizabeth had been. Below, Silas worked with their small herd, teaching Elizabeth how to gentle a young colt. "Easy now, little one," his voice carried on the wind. "Let him come to you." Sarah smiled, watching her daughter's intense concentration, the way she held perfectly still until the colt nosed forward to lip at her outstretched palm. It was a moment of perfect peace, hard-won and precious. The sound of wagon wheels on the valley road drew her attention. A small procession wound its way up, 3 wagons bearing families she recognized: the Kovacs, recently arrived from Hungary; the Chens, who'd fled California's violence against Chinese miners; the Washingtons, a freed slave family from Texas seeking a new start. They stopped at the boundary marker Silas had erected, a simple wooden sign that read, "Boone Homestead, all are welcome." "Mrs. Boone," called out Istvan Kovac in his halting English. "We come to ask, is true you help all people here?" Sarah made her way down to meet them, Elizabeth running to her side with the natural curiosity of childhood. "What do you need?" Sarah asked simply. "Work," Washington spoke up, hat in his hands. "And a fair chance. Heard tell you and your husband give both." It had started small, hiring Luis Morales when others wouldn't because of his Mexican blood, taking in Jenny Chen to help with housework when the town hotels refused to serve her family. Word had spread along trails and telegraph lines. The Boone Ranch judged people by their character, not their color. "We have a barn needs raising," Sarah said, "and camps for workers up the creek. Can't promise easy, but can promise fair." The relief on their faces was answer enough. That evening, their expanded household gathered for supper. The main cabin now anchored a small collection of buildings: bunkhouse, summer kitchen, tool sheds. Languages mixed around the table like ingredients in Sarah's stews: English, Apache, Spanish, Hungarian, Chinese. Elizabeth moved between them all, translating with the unthinking ease of a child raised in Babel. "This is what America should be," Martha Littlefield said. She'd ridden up to check on Sarah's pregnancy and stayed for supper. All of us strange folk, making something new together. Not everyone in Cedar Ridge agreed. There'd been night riders once, torches thrown, but Silas and his polyglot crew had stood firm. Sheriff Daniels, older now but still fair-minded, had made it clear that the law protected all citizens equally in his jurisdiction. "You're building a powder keg," some warned. "No," Silas would reply. "We're building a future." 2 weeks later, Sarah's labor began with the dawn. This time, she had a midwife who understood both worlds, Maria Morales, who'd learned healing from her mestiza grandmother. The birth was easier, as second births often are. And by noon, Sarah cradled a son with Silas's sandy hair and her copper skin. "Samuel," she said, looking at Silas. "For my brother-in-law, who gave his blessing, Samuel James Boone." Silas cradled his son with the same wonder he'd shown with Elizabeth, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers, the unfocused eyes that would likely darken to brown like his mother's. The christening brought the whole valley together. Reverend Patterson, who'd come to see God's work in their mixed family, performed the ceremony, the celebration after mixed traditions freely: Hungarian violin with Apache drums, Chinese dumplings alongside venison stew, formerly enslaved voices raised in spirituals that made even hardened cowboys weep. Thomas Chen, age 7, and Elizabeth had become inseparable friends, racing through the gathered crowd, playing some invented game. Watching them, Sarah felt hope bloom in her chest like spring flowers. "They don't see the differences," Emma Patterson observed. "To them, It's just Thomas and Lizzie. Best friends. That's how it should be. Sarah replied, That's the world we're building for them. As summer deepened, their small community faced its greatest test. Drought struck hard, worse than any in memory. Wells ran dry, crops withered, cattle dropped in the fields. Townfolk who'd kept their distance came seeking Sarah's knowledge of finding water. Silas's generosity with what reserves they had. Why should we help them? Luis asked one evening after another delegation left with full water barrels. They never helped us. Sarah looked at Elizabeth teaching baby Samuel to stack wooden blocks, their laughter bright against the gathering dusk. Because, she said, we're better than they were to us. Because this is how the world changes, one kindness at a time. The drought broke with autumn rains, but its lessons remained. Families who'd once crossed streets to avoid the boons now nodded in greeting. Children who'd been forbidden to play with Elizabeth now joined her lessons, where Sarah taught both Apache traditions and American letters. One cool November evening, a lone rider approached. Sarah recognized the military bearing before she saw the uniform. Captain Morrison, the same who'd questioned her years before. She stood on the porch, Samuel on her hip. Elizabeth pressed against her skirts. The captain dismounted slowly. Showing his age, he removed his hat, something he hadn't done before. Mrs. Boone, he said. I owe you an apology. Sarah waited, saying nothing. I've spent years chasing shadows, seeing enemies where there were only people trying to live. He gestured toward the valley, where cook fires from the worker camps dotted the darkness like earthbound stars. You've built something here, something maybe the rest of us could learn from. What changed your mind? Sarah asked. My daughter, he admitted. Married a Cherokee man? Fine fellow, treated her better than any white man would have. Made me think, made me see. He met her eyes. I was wrong. About you. About all of it. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Would you like some coffee? Captain, supper's past, but there's stew still warm. The surprise on his face gave way to something like gratitude. I'd be obliged. As winter settled over the mountains, the Boone homestead glowed with warmth and purpose. The main house had grown to include a schoolroom where Sarah taught, a clinic where she and Maria tended the sick. The bunkhouses housed workers of a dozen origins, all finding common ground in shared labor and mutual respect. On Christmas Eve, as had become tradition, their home filled with neighbors and friends. Jake Morrison, hair gone silver now, raised the first toast. To Silas and Sarah Boone, he said, who showed us that courage isn't about fighting what's different, it's about embracing it. Glasses raised throughout the room, more than before. Sarah noticed, more faces, more acceptance, more hope. Later, as the celebration continued, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The stars wheeled overhead in the clear mountain air. The same stars her ancestors had used to navigate. The same ones that had guided Silas through war and loss. She felt his presence before his arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on her head. No regrets? He asked. Their old question. None, she answered, leaning back against his solid warmth. We built something good here. We did. From inside came the sound of Elizabeth's laughter, Samuel's delighted squealing. Voices raised in a multilingual Christmas carol that no composer had written, but everyone seemed to know. You know what I see? Sarah said softly. I see our grandchildren growing up in a world where difference is celebrated, not feared, where love matters more than blood, where character counts more than color. From your lips to God's ears. Silas murmured. They stood there together. Two people who'd found each other across impossible divides, who'd built a family and a community on the revolutionary idea that all people deserved dignity and respect. The night wind carried the scent of pine and promise, of wood smoke and dreams made real. Inside, someone started a fiddle tune, and feet began to dance. Sarah turned in Silas's arms, smiling up at him. Dance with me? Always, he said. and led her back into the light and warmth, back to their family of choice and chance, back to the future they were building one day at a time. The fiddles sang, voices joined in harmony, and in a valley that had once known only division, people of all origins danced together, celebrating the simple radical act of seeing each other as human. Love had chosen no color, asked no permission, followed no rules but its own, and in choosing each other, Silas and Sarah had lit a candle whose light would spread far beyond Eagle Creek, carried in the hearts of all those who'd learned that home wasn't about where you came from. It was about who stood beside you when the world tried to tear you apart. As the music played and their children laughed and their friends celebrated, that light grew ever brighter, a beacon of hope in a world still learning how to heal. Thank you all for joining us around the Wild West Campfire to hear Sarah and Silas's story. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let's connect across the miles, just like our characters connected across their differences. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, love, and the untamed frontier. Share your thoughts below. What spoke to you most about their journey? Until next time, partners, keep that campfire burning bright.